Good afternoon. It's nice to see some faces back. This is the third in our series of evening forums on the achievement gap, what we know, what we still need to learn. It's the introductory series for the Achievement Gap Initiative at Harvard University, which is an effort to Harvard's research resources that can be of use to the nation's or value for helping to solve the nation's achievement gap challenges. And we've got working groups in a number of different areas that I've introduced and talked a little bit about the last couple nights. I won't go back over that right now. Tonight's topic is early childhood. Those of you who have been to the first couple sessions know I've started off each one with a poem, which I'm going to do again tonight. This is the poem that I did for an early childhood conference. It was mostly early childhood providers last year. It's just to give an image and a feel for the people we're concerned about as we conduct this evening session. It's called Preschool Foundations. The children seem so tiny as they move about the room. Still, they're complicated people, so much more than we assume. Each is different from the others, none the same as all the rest. So I strive to understand them, and it puts me to the test. Keisha likes to count things backward. Pedro likes to pull my hair. Franco marches like a soldier, and Herman stands up in the chairs. But each in his or her own way is curious and growing, learning more about the world each day with new things that they're knowing. And my job is to be sure that they know love is all around, and that I'm here to help them learn new words and smells and sounds. No one's job is more important than what I do here each day. Things I teach will shape the future for these children now at play. As among the first to teach them, I must build a firm foundation, because for all I know, young Keisha Jones will someday lead the nation. And even if she doesn't, there's a lot that is at stake. God made me her preschool teacher. That I'm here is no mistake. And I guess we might want to think that we're here is no mistake, because part of our agenda is to help make the world a better place for all kids, beginning at their earliest ages. We know from recent research there is no throwaway period in the life course. There's important work to be done at every period, beginning in early childhood. And that's what we're here to talk about this afternoon. Our speakers this afternoon are three people who've done work on early childhood, who are doing work, and who are contemplating further work on early childhood. And this evening we want to talk about some work that is in the past and some work that's in the future, and then have some exchange with you in the audience about the various issues that get raised tonight. I'll do brief introductions for each of them in the order that they will speak. The first speaker will be Roland Fryer. Roland is a junior fellow with the Harvard Society of Fellows, and in 2006 he will begin work as an assistant professor of economics, also here at Harvard. For the last couple of years, he's been a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research interests include affirmative action, discrimination, social economics, and recently he's been doing work on early childhood, analyzing the early childhood longitudinal study, and some of the work that he'll talk about today. He earned his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Texas and his PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania State University. He also spent most of the time when he was writing his dissertation with the economics department at the University of Chicago. David Grissmer is a senior management scientist at RAND. His PhD is actually in physics, but I don't know if David remembers the last time he actually did physics. He's been working on public schooling and education issues for a long time. His education research studies include teacher supply and demand, teacher compensation and attrition patterns, analyses of test scores to determine the causes of changing trends, analyzing state test scores to determine causes of state differences and the effects of class size reduction. He's currently working with the Office of Science and Technology in the White House to assess the federal research and development portfolio on children and methods of improving research on children. His current work also includes developing estimates of the number and location of children at risk in the United States and analyzing achievement patterns in central city, suburban, and rural schools. And his presence tonight is partly a function of the fact that he is in the process of organizing a center on early childhood research that will also tie in lots of the researchers from across the United States who do early childhood work. Kathleen McCartney is the academic dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a professor of education here at the Graduate School of Education. She conducts research on issues that include child care, poverty, parenting, behavior genetics theory, and social policy. For the past 13 years, she's served as a principal investigator of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development's study of child care and youth development. By tracking 1,364 children from birth through 6th grade, the study aims to examine the effects of early child care on areas such as parent-child relationships, child development, and children's later success in transitioning to school. The data gathered from the research are the most comprehensive on child care to date. She has also been the director of the University of New Hampshire Child Study and Development Center, which is a laboratory school for 138 children from birth through kindergarten, and she teaches courses on early childhood development. She holds a PhD from Yale University. We're going to begin with Roland, and so let's start.
Thank you. Oops, wow. Ooh, wow. Great. Thanks for having me. These three, I call them night seminars that Ron has put together. And it's really nice to put them together with Ron and his staff, and for lowering your standards and having me. I want to talk about the black-white test score gap in the first 2 years of school. I'm Roland Fryer. I'm in the Harvard Society of Fellows. He really interrupted my joke there. So I'm Roland Fryer. I'm in the Harvard Society of Fellows, or as my wife puts it, a fancy name for unemployment. So I'll talk a bit about test score gaps before we even start. You know the statistics, okay? So the National Association of Education Progress tells us that the average black 17-year-old reads at the proficiency level of the average white 13-year-old, okay? SAT differences between blacks and whites are enormous. I mean, and this has been true. This is true not only now. It's been true since the testing of Negro intelligence in the 1900s. I mean, the black-white test score gap is a robust and very disturbing reality. But tonight I want to talk about kind of not really a new approach whatsoever, but kind of new data to think about this question. So I'm going to show you data, results from data analyzed for 20,000 kindergartners. Okay? So these kids, we have all sorts of information on their parents, their background, how much their parents read to them, et cetera, for 20,000 kids in 1,000 schools. So not only can we compare across schools, but we can actually compare within schools. Over the first 2 years of school, and we have 4 tests over these first 2 years of school. So we have when they first came into kindergarten, so we can look at, control for a host of background factors and look at gaps right when kids enter kindergarten. Now, why is that special? That's special because, one, we really haven't had good measures of a nationally representative data set to measure racial differences in test scores when kids enter school. The statistics I gave you were statistics later on in life, and those could be compounded for a number of factors. But what one might want to do is think about the test score gap when kids, right when they enter school. Now, we've had some data on this through, data sets generated when babies are born with low birth rate, et cetera, but those aren't nationally representative. So one of the things I'm so excited about this data is it's actually nationally representative. You have 20,000 kids, and you have 1,000 schools that allows you to do within-school analysis. What else is special about the data? We have 4 tests over the first 2 years of school. So we have fall kindergarten, then we have spring kindergarten, then we have fall first grade, and spring first grade. Okay. That's great because we have 4 tests over the first 2 years of school, and it's also kind of nice because we have these 2 endpoints in some sense. We have spring kindergarten and we have fall first grade, so we can really look at whether or not kids are losing ground over the summer, for example, because that's one of the things that you might think generates the test score gaps. And the other thing that's really nice about the data is that not only do we have cognitive assessments, so I don't have a blackboard here, there's a 2x2 matrix, and in one side there's an ice cream cone, and the other side there's a bear, and then there's the number 7, and then there's the letter X. And questions are like, which one's a number? Okay? So not only do we have direct cognitive assessments, but we also have indirect cognitive assessments. That is, they actually ask the teachers, how well do you think Keisha is doing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So it's really terrific data, and I'm very happy to show you some of the results from this data. Okay? Now, I don't have a poem like Ron, but if you'd like, I can do interpretive dance. Okay, so let me show you some results. These may be a little small since the room is so big. I wasn't expecting this, but I will translate for you. Okay? Now, since 1900, since the testing of Negro intelligence, there have been maybe one, but very, very few studies, if any, that have been able to control for any factors and show that the black-white test score gap doesn't exist. Okay? And that's this type of thing where you say, okay, let's control for a host of background factors, income, occupation of the parents, et cetera, and let's see what's left over. That's the type of analysis that, got Hernston and Murray in trouble, because what did they do? They said, if you control for income and occupation and all these things, well, you only get rid of about 1/3 of the black-white test score gap, and so therefore the other 2/3 must be genetics. Now, of course, we know, and since they've been beaten up a lot, that that's crazy to just interpret the residual of a regression as genetics, but the idea is the same, and it's in the regression framework here. What we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, what we want to do is look at test scores between blacks and whites, and we're going to control for a host of other background factors on the when we're doing this. So basically, we want to compare Johnny and Jawan, accounting for the fact that their parents may earn different income, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? That's what we're going to do here. Now, I have math and I have reading tests. These are kindergartners, and when I was in kindergarten, I couldn't read. I can barely read now. And so they're given orally, just to make that clear. Okay? So we have 10 columns here. The first 5 are all to do with math. The second 5 are for reading. Okay, so what do we have here? Now, I've taken the test scores and normalized them so that they're standard normals. That's a fancy name for it. They have mean 0 and a standard deviation of 1. It just makes the coefficients I'm going to show you interpretable. So when I talked about test score gaps before, the SAT gap is approximately, I think it's around a standard deviation difference between blacks and whites. So that'll give you some sense to be able to juxtapose these numbers. Okay? So here's what we have. The black-white test score gap when kids enter school accounted for nothing. This is just raw gap. This is not accounting for the fact that there's differences in income, et cetera, among their parents. Just the raw test score gap is about 0.6 of a standard deviation for blacks and about 0.7 of a standard deviation for Hispanics. And Asians are actually winning this race at the start of kindergarten on a magnitude of about, if I round up, 0.2 standard deviations. Okay? Now, let me put this in context. Because these other studies that we've used that have used low birth weight babies and things like that as data sets to analyze the black-white test score gap early in life, they've had these numbers be a standard deviation when kids enter school. Okay, just the raw test score gap. So one of two things is happening here. One, either this is just better nationally representative data or different tests or something like that, or these kids are actually more recent kids. So these kids were in kindergarten, I believe, in 1998 or so. Okay, so these are more recent kids. So you might think, column 1 actually gives me some hope, because column 1 says, okay, just in the raw gap, before we control for anything, the black-white test score gap is smaller than we've ever seen before. Okay, which is consistent with, though not definitive proof of, just real progress in terms of the raw test scores. Okay, as we move across the columns, what I'm basically going to do is start accounting for more and more background variables. All right. Don't worry about reading all this stuff. I'm going to tell you. I just wanted to put it up to prove that I actually had some numbers. Okay. All right. So the second column just says, what if we can only compare kids whose parents have the same occupation, education, and income? Okay. So they have very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay? What you see here is that in mathematics, that almost knocks the gap in half. Right? And in particular, it knocks it down to about 0.4 of a standard deviation. And in reading, where is that coming? Okay, wrong. That's cheating. Okay, yeah, that'd be great. They would never give someone with my level of maturity one of these things. Okay, so here, the reading once you account for just income, is about 1/10 of a standard deviation. So these are really, really small gaps when kids are entering school. Okay, so let's just skip because I only have finite time here. So let's skip to column 4. This basically says if you control for socioeconomic status, the number of children's books in the home, okay, this thing squared, which takes care of nonlinearity, is just statistical stuff. Don't worry about that. Gender, age at the fall of kindergarten, birth weight, and basically the age of your mother and whether or not you were a WIC participant. Okay, now this may seem like an odd set of covariates to use. Why the heck are you using these and not others? Well, we think of these as a broad set of proxies for background in some sense, the type of living environment that a kid has before they enter kindergarten. And just in case you're really a skeptic like me, column 5 includes over 100 regressors, and we get the same answer. Okay, but let's concentrate on column 4. This basically says that the black-white test score gap in math, once you control for the type for kids with similar background and, dare I say, home environment, but I really want to put that in quotes, is small in math. It's less than 1/10 of a standard deviation. And in reading, the black kids are actually outperforming the white kids. Okay? They're 1/10 of a standard deviation above the white kids. Right? So if you average those things out, basically, at kindergarten entry, the black and the white kids are doing very, very, very similar to each other once you control for background factors. Okay? So that's one thing. The title of this is What Do We Know and What Do We Need to Know? So this is something I think we know. I've got plenty we need to know, so let's just hold on. Let's just move along. Okay, now I'm going to put this up, but I'm not going to do much with it. This is a table that says how sensitive are these results? Okay, because economists are skeptical of everything. So this says if you do it by gender, by socioeconomic quintile, by family structure, by region, by location type, if you use other types of test scores, if you don't weight them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you push, if you pull, if you stretch, these results, they look the same. That's what this basically says. Okay, that this is a real robust reality that the black-white test score gap when kids enter school is very, very similar for kids with similar backgrounds. Again, I want to stress that that was for Ron. I thought he was going to have a question. Here we are. All right. So Johnny and Jamal walk in kindergarten with similar backgrounds. They have similar test scores. What happens over the first 2 years of school? Here, these are the results I just showed you from fall kindergarten in math, fall kindergarten in reading. I've also put up results from spring kindergarten and spring first grade. For the sake of time, let's just skip to spring first grade. The black kids are losing almost 0.2 standard deviations relative to white kids, controlling for all these factors still in math. In reading, where they're actually doing better than the whites, they're even losing more ground relative to the white kids. Okay. Now, this is about 0.6 standard deviations over here, about 0.8 over here. You might say, well, in real people terms, what does that mean? That's about 3 months worth of schooling. Okay. So you take similar people. The black-white test score gap when kids enter school is essentially 0. But over the first 2 years of school, the black kids lose ground at a rate equivalent to about 3 months of schooling over this time. So the question is, why? And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay. The first thing you might think, summer setback. It's that over the summer, black kids aren't going to museums or something or whatever, I don't know, some theory like that, and they're just losing ground relative to whites over the summer because of neighborhood factors or a host of other factors. Well, we can test that because remember, we have these 2 test scores. We have the one when they leave school, spring kindergarten, and we have the test when they basically arrive in fall first grade. All right, so concentrate on this black box here. This is the above panel is doing it just in the raw gaps. This is doing it with controls. Let's look with controls. Here you see that the black-white, the test score gap changes just a slight bit over the summer in math, but these things aren't statistically significant here. And in reading, they actually seem to do a little better, but again, not statistically significant. So the point is that they're not losing ground relative to whites over the summer. Here's where they're losing it. when they're in school. So in first grade, they lose a substantial amount in math, and they lose a substantial amount in reading in first grade and some reading in kindergarten. Okay, so the point here is, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to, this is a poor man's approach to empirical work. We don't have really any slick research design. We're trying to say, look, what are the mechanism, we're trying to identify the mechanism that is causing the black students to lose ground over the first 2 years of school, and one hypothesis is it's differences in summer environment. But if that were true, then I would expect that, at least in these data, that they will be losing ground more over the summer. But they're not. They're losing ground while they're in school. Okay? So let's think about what else it could be. You might say, well, there's some sort of testing differences, or maybe it's the test, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's hard to really assess kids at that age. Well, remember, what's nice, another nice feature of this data is that we have subjective teacher assessments of how the kids are doing. So one question is, we see in these cognitive tests that they're losing ground over the first 2 years of school. Is the same also true with the subjective teacher assessments? And you see the exact same thing here, okay? That the black-white gap in the data from the teacher's perspective changes on almost the exact magnitude as the actual test, okay? For the black-white gap, for the reading gap. I should also emphasize this. Hispanics are doing the exact opposite. They're not losing ground relative to whites. They're actually gaining ground relative to whites over the first 2 years of school. And that's, frankly, been a very tough nut for me to crack. I don't quite know why it is. My guess is that given these tests are administered orally, that English language skills has a lot to do with it. But I don't have any evidence that that's actually true. That's a hunch. Okay. So here the point is that if we thought that it was purely due to something about the strange cognitive test that you give to a kindergartner that's causing the black-white trajectories to diverge over the first 2 years of school, well, not really, because the subjective teacher assessments give us the same thing. Okay? So let's keep looking for other things we can do. So the Asian kids actually gain ground. This is kind of an anomaly. The Asian kids gain ground relative to whites in the teacher's assessment, but they're actually losing ground relative to whites on the actual cognitive test, right? Why is that? These magnitudes are very similar, but the teachers rated them as not nearly as good when they first came to school, when they actually were much better than the white students were after you control for these things. Okay? Uh-oh, sorry. Now, you might say, well, is it something to do with the teacher's race interacted with the student? Maybe, that the student says, man, that's bad, and the teacher says, no, it's not bad, it's good. He says, that's what I meant, et cetera, et cetera. So something like, some interaction like that. Well, I want to be, in the spirit of having all hands above board, I don't think this is a perfect test of that, but it's the best we can do with the data. Okay, so let me tell you what the test is. What we've done is say, let's compare the trajectory of students, one of which neither their kindergarten nor first grade teacher is black, and one who has a black teacher either in kindergarten or in first grade. Okay? Again, this is not perfect. Why do we have to cut this data like this? Because we didn't have enough data in terms of white kids that had black teachers all the way through the first 2 years of school. If we had done that as a column, we would have had very few observations. All right, so what happens here? Suppose you have neither kindergarten nor first grade teacher is black. If we just do the full sample here, they seem to lose ground very similar. Well, actually, they lose a little more ground relative to whites if they have a black teacher. If anything, they lose a little ground. They lose more ground relative to whites when they actually have a black teacher. Okay? So that would go exactly opposite direction, you think, if it really were teacher bias that were causing these trajectories to diverge over the first 2 years of school. Okay? Again, this is not a perfect test. It's the best we can do with the data. And with the data we have, we just can't find any evidence that the trajectory of the first 2 years of school is a result of teacher bias, that they're treating the black kids differently for these particular test scores. Okay. Even if you look at teacher assessments, not even the cognitive scores, as a function of the teacher's race, you get the same basic result. Okay? So teacher bias, in terms of this particular data, summer setback, just doesn't seem to explain these divergent trajectories. What else we have? Well, you might think, I don't want to show you those yet. Okay, I'll give you the answer. What I think the answer is. I was trying to build up for the drama like Law and Order, but I couldn't. Okay, so here's what we do. Now let's say, well, is it school quality that could be producing the different results? Okay, that is, we know in the data that 35% of white kids go to a school where absolutely no black kids are. So if there's school quality differences across schools, then that could produce this trajectory, right? Because we're aggregating everybody into the same pot and looking at test score trajectories of everyone. But if the white kids are going to school with more resources, et cetera, then differences in school quality could produce the different trajectories that I've asked. So how can we test this? Well, we can look within schools. We can just say, let's compare the trajectory of black and white kids who are in the same schools. Okay? Because remember, we got 20,000 kids, we got 1,000 schools. So we can do school fixed effects. That is, we can identify the relevant parameter off of all the variation you get within school, not across schools. Okay? Let's do that. Here we are. This says, the reason we have two columns here is this is the full sample of students. This is excluding students attending all white schools. The reason you want to do that is because the fixed effects estimator is not going to, it's going to throw out schools with all white kids because it's only identifying variation off of black and white kids in the same school. Okay. All right. So this gives you the fall kindergarten score. It's about -0.14. It's very similar to our full sample. This is the spring first grade score, which is about -0.26. It's a difference of about 0.13. Okay? That's how much ground they're losing in math, and in reading they're losing about 0.16. Okay? Now, suppose we do school fixed effects. That is, we say let's identify all the relevant variation off of kids within the same schools. Well, this difference, -0.13, drops down to about -0.05 and is not statistically significant. What that means is that black kids and white kids in the same schools have very similar trajectories. Where they're losing ground relative to white kids is across schools, not within schools. Is that okay? So this research for me played out like a drama. First thing I saw was that you could eliminate the black-white test score gap with like 7 controls. I was very excited. I thought this was gonna make a big splash. And then I realized over the first 2 years of school, they lose ground. And I said, uh-oh. And then I saw this result. I got excited again, but then now I get upset again. Okay, so you might think, well, what components of school quality are actually pushing that, right? I've told you that we have this black box thing called a school fixed effect, but that's just an amorphous term that means you're comparing kids within the same school. What is it about that school that makes these, that's really doing it? Well, or what it is about the differences across schools. Here's what I've done here. I've looked at the coefficient on race and predicting level of school input, and I've done it by different types of school quality proxies that you have in the data. And I've controlled also for all of our other kind of variables like income, occupation of parents, education of parents, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might think that you wouldn't have big school quality differences after you've controlled for parental background variables. At least you hope. Let's look. So if you look at average class size, that's very, very similar after you control for all these other outcomes. Now, I absolutely understand. If you look in the data, blacks have very different average class size than whites. But again, you got to remember, all this stuff is controlling for this host of background variables. Okay. So I think the interesting thing about this table is that on things that I want to call are traditional measures, or even if you want to be provocative, quick fixes, things like average class size, whether or not your teacher has a master's degree, the computer-student ratio, the internet hookup-student ratio, et cetera, you see that there's really no difference between blacks and whites on these kind of traditional measures of school quality. All right, let's look at some things I found kind of interesting. Percent of students in the school with free lunch. There are a lot, so blacks are there's 19% more likely to be in schools where they're giving free lunch, even after controlling for all this host of background information. Gang problems in the school, that's significant. Problems with teacher turnover, litter around the school. I love this data set. These people, the actual people who were actually doing the thing, they actually walked around the school and coded how much clutter and litter and things like that were around the school. I don't know what it means, but it's kind of interesting. People loitering around the school. I like that one too. Receives PTA funding, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the kind of things that you don't think of as traditional measures of school quality, like teacher-student ratios and average class, et cetera, et cetera. But these things are very, very different between blacks and whites after you've controlled for this host of background factors. Now, the question, which I don't have the answer to, maybe you do, is how these things actually influence the educational production function, because that's what we care about. Right? Just because there's differences, if they don't mean anything, then we're still stuck back at square one. And so the problem here for me is when you control for these school quality variables in a simple way, just in a linear regression, they don't seem to do anything to these diverging trajectories. Okay? But here's a footnote. We got to remember this. When you're comparing school fixed effects, you're looking at two kids going into the same school. We know that. But two kids who are going to the same school are two kids who probably live in the same neighborhood and things like that. So school fixed effects is a big black box. It's not a little black box. School fixed, it's not a black box just centered around the school. It's a black box centered around all the mechanisms that push those kids into schools. Okay? And I think that's what we have to understand going forward, is if kids are coming to school and they're very similar on test scores. Okay? Now you might think that you can't measure a kindergartner's test score, and you can measure much better a first grader's test score. That turns out just not to be true, is an explanation for why these kids are diverging. I think this is real divergence in test scores. And if you were to make a simple linear extrapolation, I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but if you were to do that, then the gaps you would see, if you just made a linear extrapolation for how much they're losing ground the first 2 years, how much they're going to lose ground in the next 10 years, you'd get the same kind of test score gaps that I started with initially. Okay? One last thing I want to tell you, I want to show you. Where are they losing ground? So they break out the data for us into different sections. Count, number, and shapes, relative size, is this star bigger than that star, et cetera, et cetera. Ordinality and sequence, what comes after 3, is it 4? Adding them, subtracting, and multiplying and dividing. Okay? And in reading, it's letter recognition, beginning sounds, ending sounds, sight words, and words in context. Those are the different components of the test. Okay? So one question is, if we really want to understand what's going on over the first 2 years of school, we got to really understand which components they're losing ground on and which ones they're not. Okay? So let's look at that, and then we'll end with that. If you look in math, nobody is getting adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing in kindergarten, okay? Which is probably to be expected. And there's not really any gaps here developing. These are, to be clear, what we're doing here is instead of our aggregate test score on the left-hand side with all our host of background variables predicting that, what we're doing is we're putting each element on the left-hand side with our host of background variables predicting that. Okay? But spring first grade, to cut to the chase, the black kids are losing all the ground in adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing, which you might think are abstract concepts or where teacher quality may matter more. I don't know why that is. But I do know, I'm not that smart, but I do know that adding and subtracting is easier than understanding relative size for a first grader. Okay. And so it's breaking open the box. It's getting inside why we think the black kids are losing ground on these things that might be considered kind of abstract or higher order type concepts is the way I think we can make some more progress on this issue. Okay, and really trying to understand what it actually is in this school fixed effect that's actually driving the results. So there's two things I want you to, or a few things I want you to take away from this. One, if you control for just a few host background factors, black and white kids are very similar. Call them the same when they enter kindergarten. over the first 2 years of school, the black kids lose 3 months worth of schooling. And essentially, we think that it could be school quality that is the culprit, though we don't know, because the school fixed effect is a big thing. It's an amorphous term. We really don't exactly know, and that's where I think the frontier is on this stuff. Reading. Reading. They lose ground in basically everything. So in reading, there's gaps in kindergarten in ending sounds, in letter recognition, beginning sound. It's basically uniform across the different parts of tests in reading. However, I can tell you, I do have the third grade data for this, which I haven't shown you because I only had 20, 30 minutes or whatever I've had. And what you see in the data, let me try to explain this. What you see in the data is you see this, this horse race going on. So there's, multiplying and dividing and adding and subtracting is hard. So the white kids get it first, and then the black kids start to catch up, right? But then when things get harder, place value, decimals, things like that, then they're off here, and they're still trying to catch up. And so the gaps are actually getting larger and larger in the data, right? So trying to understand these things, I really think, I'm very optimistic about this, this would help us a great deal at understanding what's going on the first 2 years of school. Okay, thanks.
Let me first apologize for having some laryngitis. My wife says that when she listens to me, it feels like I'm in pain, but I'm not. I'm also not contagious, so the first row doesn't need to move back. I'm going to cut my remarks a little shorter than I had planned because I want to save some time for questions and before my voice wears out. I think as was indicated earlier, most of what we know about black-white score gaps come from analyzing data of fourth graders and beyond usually. And what that data has shown us is that the United States is basically divided very cleanly into at least two groups. About 52% of students are advantaged white students, and they're scoring about the 65th percentile nationally. And these scores are good enough for them to be internationally competitive. So basically about half of our kids in the nation would score pretty high in terms of international competitiveness. One of our chief goals in this nation, of course, there's really two goals. One is to decrease the gap in achievement internationally, and the other is to decrease the gap internally. So if we're going to decrease the gap internationally, it's clear that we have to work on the 48% of kids who are not advantaged white in order to close that gap. The rest of the students can be divided by minority and income status, and they sort of go along a range, but the black free lunch kids are down around the 30th to 35th percentile. Black children who are not eligible for free lunch, more advantaged, someplace in the 40th, 42nd percentile. Hispanics are in somewhere between 35 and 45. Native Americans are a little higher than Hispanics. But the biggest gap in the scores are basically between advantaged whites and sort of the rest. So when we talk about gaps, I think we should sort of be sure we focus both on the disadvantage of income and the disadvantage of race in terms of analyzing these. What we know about score gaps from fourth grade and beyond, their size are large. The gap was actually closed by about a third to a half between kids who started school in 1970 and 1985. That is, the black score gaps were about 33% higher prior to 1970. The reason for that change is not completely pinned down or parsed out, but it certainly is some combination of the fact that that's what the nation tried to do through civil rights legislation, through compensatory programs, through desegregation, through things like class size reductions, which would have benefited black students more. So if you just look at the sort of cohorts of kids moving through school, dramatic reductions in the black-white score gap from those entering in 70 to about 85. It stopped after 1985. And I think most of us are still puzzled by why it stopped. I think Ron probably has the best hypothesis, which is really a cultural hypothesis. But it's still, I think, a fair mystery of why we made so much progress for like 15 years, and then it's really stopped. Progress has stopped. The second thing that we tend to know about score gaps, I think the first speaker covered. The old way was to try to see how much of the score gap could be explained by the differences in family characteristics. And before the kindergarten data came along, typically you could explain 70, 80% by family characteristics. Now that doesn't actually get you very far in terms of solving a gap, because you're not going to all of a sudden create the same family characteristics in black families as you're in white families. You've got to get much more specific and find efficient ways of solving it. So the fact that we can explain it by family characteristics is helpful, but it doesn't sort of get us to a solution very quickly. A couple of things are changing, which I think is going to really help us to understand in the next 10 years not only what the sources of the gaps are, but I think the politics is changing that might actually put some pressure to do something about it, which would be a change. The politics is changing, I think, for the following reason. We've always sort of treated the black-white score gap, the Hispanic-white score gap, as an equity issue. We just believe in equal outcomes. We're a nation that prides ourselves on those kinds of things, so we should address those kinds of gaps. A very cynical person would say our economy has done fairly well in the last 30 years when the gaps were there. So why address them? Very cynical view. What's changing is that our future economic competitiveness depends more and more on kids that are sort of have current gaps doing well, becoming technically more proficient. But the thing that's really beginning to scare people is that our economy has depended a great deal on importing talent from abroad. Our graduate schools, our immigration laws have been geared to bring very talented people to this shore. About 27% of U.S. scientists come from abroad. Recently, in the last 3 years, that immigration into graduate school has started to decline for a number of reasons. Not only the transaction cost of students coming here, but foreign universities are getting more popular, and the kids that go through graduate school are not staying as much. That begins to be pretty scary for those people who are planning economies, because we really have depended a lot on importing talent from abroad. If we don't import as much talent from abroad, that means we have to depend more on talent we develop here. So I think that there will be, some more attention paid to this, because it's really beginning to sort of where the rubber meets the road. I think that's unfortunate that we can't do it based on other reasons, but I think this will actually help. There are a couple of other, dramatic things changing. One is what Irv talked about, is the data is just getting much, much better. We had to rely on data from 4th grade on that didn't have many family variables and so forth. The kindergarten data is the most comprehensive and largest data set, and we're sort of tracking kids through 5th grade. They now got money to do 7th grade, so it'll be a longitudinal all the way from kindergarten. Perhaps more importantly, they begin tracking babies. And they've actually collected data from the first cohort of babies that's 7 months, and they're going to track those up all the way too. So we're going to have data that sort of spans the important time. Everybody agrees these days that you have to intervene early, that it's more efficient to intervene early, and if you don't, it gets harder and harder to close gaps. So the more and better data we get is going to enable us to, I think, address these problems. The other thing, the other thing that's dramatically changing is our view of what causes score gaps. I think of most of us who do the kinds of educational research that has been traditional, we're pushed to the wall. Our view of what happens in the brain would have been that there's a little piece of the brain up there which we envision as a little computer, which has a certain processing speed, memory speed, but that what you do on academic achievement is pretty much sort of confined to that little part of the brain. You have faster memory, more working memory, faster processing speed, and that's what does it. Those of us who have done that kind of research, at least for me, become very embarrassed when we begin to read what actually goes on in the brain and what the developmental scientists have learned over the past 10 years about brain development and the sort of origins of even cognitive achievement. The views over there range from, I think, outstanding people who now would say that emotional development is the basis of cognitive development, to cognitive development certainly is a very complex set of developmental skills, each of which rest on top of each other and have to develop simultaneously in order for the whole machine to operate. And an example of, if you think about simply what it takes a kid to read across the page, there's a complex function of coordinating eye movement across the page at the same time that pattern recognition is going on in words. Words are changed into phonetic parts, are decoded, and all of this has to take place while the kid has to exclude other kinds of stimulants coming in to his environment. It turns out this is a very complex brain function to do very simple things. And the new kind of, when I say new, it is that if you talk to kindergarten teachers or talk to developmental psychologists, they sort of look at you like, where have you been for the past 15 years? I remember talking to one kindergarten teacher, and I was quite excited about some findings I was having about the developmental part of this. And she sort of looked at me and said, you mean you didn't know that fine motor skills were necessary for kindergarten students to do well? And I said, well, no, not really. There's going to be a wonderful integration of what the knowledge is that's being gained from brain research from the developmental community with what has traditionally been the community that's analyzed score gaps. The data is going to be there to do it, and if we can sort of, I don't know if it takes knocking of heads or just embarrassment to get different academic communities to talk to each other on these kinds of things. But the picture of what causes score gaps is getting very, very refined by the one community. That refinement has not made its way into what the other community tends to do. And so I consider the problem of score gaps now to be mostly a scientific problem. It is to find the origin of the score gaps and to find the necessary interventions. Some of the, we've also worked with the data that Irv had talked about, the ECLS, and have sort of come up with a lot of the same kinds of findings. But we've also focused on what I call the developmental set of skills that were measured. Fine motor skills, gross motor skills, social skills, internalizing behavior, depression, things like that. And it turns out they're very important predictors. In fact, they're much more important predictors than any of the other set of variables we usually use. And these predictors vary a lot by racial ethnic characteristics. So that black students actually have the finest gross motor skills. They're about 6 months ahead of other racial groups. And it turns out that gross motor skills are important for math. They do predict math scores. When you talk to the brain people about this, they actually have stories about why you need gross motor skills and the spatial ability that goes with maneuvering yourself in space in order to understand math. I mean, there's sort of a story that goes along with that. However, black students have the worst fine motor skills, with Asian students right up there. And if you take the set of developmental skills, it can explain about half of the black-white score gap. Now, the reason that this becomes important is it gives you a finer focus on how to intervene. We're publishing a report in probably 2 or 3 months, but there's enough twins on this sample on the ECLS that you can actually determine whether the source of these skills are biological or in the family. And it turns out that all of the important developmental skills, it looks like, for the cognitive part, is formed in the family rather than sort of biologically determined. And I can go into that a lot. But what I think it begins to indicate is that there are differences that go on within families, whether it's child rearing, whether it's parental behavior, whether it's just opportunity for things to happen. I mean, you have to have pencils and papers to develop fine motor skills and that kind of thing. But that the causes of some of these things, developmental prerequisites of cognitive development, appear to be things that are developmental skills formed in the family that you need in order to finally be able to sort of score well on a test. And as we begin to sort of talk about some of these results, you get an awful lot of sort of anecdotal data about what the sources of some of these things may be. My wife happens to be a family and marriage therapist, and so she's sort of goes wild with these kinds of things. But I think the feeling is that, I think Ron was the first one that pointed this out to me, there are different cultural things that go on. Black families tend to sing, tell stories, do a whole set of wonderful things. White tend to read more. And these are just cultural. I mean, it's sort of the way things are done. If you look at the Native American community, they do something different. If you look at the Asian community, they do things different. And we have never sort of connected the things that they do different with the fact that it might affect their ability to develop cognitively. And so I think there's sort of a whole new frontier opening here that comes out of both brain development. I mean, wonderful thing on brain development of dyslexia, how that develops in the brain and what parts of the brain don't work in dyslexia. So there's a absolutely wonderful sort of, I say, frontier opening up, which gives me an awful lot of hope that we'll finally sort of get a handle on this problem and be able to do something about it. The pieces are coming together, and I think that if the right kinds of research and people get together, that an awful lot can be done on that. Thank you.
Well, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I think it's important to tell you that that's the lens through which I've been thinking about the achievement gap data. And I've been thinking about it because Dick Murnane, who's here, and John Willett and Kristen Bubb and I are actually trying to replicate the Fryer and Levitt findings using a different data set, a data set that I've been involved in. So what I did was use this invitation as an opportunity to think through a couple of things. The first is why the Fryer and Levitt papers are so important. And the second is what kind of contextual explanations have been used to explain the gap. And what I'd like to do at the end is actually just speculate a little bit about what I think could prevent the gap. So I want to begin with the Fryer and Levitt papers. The 2004 paper was widely discussed by social scientists across disciplines. That's probably an understatement. And I think the reason is because of this provocative kindergarten finding that you can eliminate the gap. And as Roland was implying, I think in his reference to the bell curve and other kinds of studies, over the years, achievement gap data have generated controversial arguments about nature and nurture. And I think that, the sad legacy of that debate really continues. And I can talk more about that if we have time, but I'm going to skip ahead. As a developmentalist, I'm really struck by the fact that the gap changes, that it increases over time. And Fryer and Levitt test a number of different possible explanations for this change. One has to do with school quality, and Roland talked about that. Now, Roland, am I right that by 4th grade, the school fixed effects analysis shows that the blacks are actually losing more than the whites? That's what I thought.
It's cut down, but it doesn't cut the whole thing down.
Right, right. So that means that you can't explain the whole thing by school quality. And they also think about a number of different explanations, like maybe it has something to do with parental inputs. And I think that's really provocative because it may be that home learning supports are actually more important over time. Maybe home learning supports the parents provide are more important in 2nd and 3rd grade than they are in kindergarten and 1st grade. And Roland also talked about the test material. It's sort of hard to know whether or not that explanation could work. But if you sort of look historically at how developmentalists and other people who have been concerned about the mechanisms have tried to explain the gap, they've really focused on the two contexts that are most proximal to the children's experience: what they experience in home and what they experience in school. And with respect to the home environment, I mean, for blacks, there's a lot of speculation and ethnographic data showing that the home environments are less language-rich, for example. In schools, there's lots of evidence showing that the schooling experience of blacks are not as good as whites. But again, I think the Fryer and Levitt, at least the 4th grade paper, suggests that something else is going on. And there's just a whole host of evidence that's looked at these socioeconomic indicators, again examined in this paper, because we assume that those indicators are proximal of experiences, right? So economic, occupational, and health indicators per se don't influence children. Money doesn't influence children. It's what the money buys that influences children. So I think when you look at sort of this studies, and now I'm not talking about this one, but just in general, if you look at if you review the literature on the achievement gap and you look at these studies, these sort of socialization effects and SES effects, what's really missing is the developing child. In all of these models, there's the assumption, I guess, that the child is a black box and that things are happening to the child. But in fact, the child is a cognitive thinking organism who is interpreting the inputs that he or she experiences. So I want to give you examples of the kinds of mechanisms that psychologists have written about. Some of you are probably familiar with Claude Steele's work on self-image threats. He has demonstrated in the laboratory how group stereotypes influence intellectual performance. Okay? So in the case of girls, they internalize stereotypes about math ability. They come to believe that they can't do it. In the case of blacks, they internalize stereotypes about intellectual ability. They believe that they're not as smart as whites. And black teachers believe that too. So, and there's sort of another set of expectancy effects in the context of schooling, and that is, what is it do teachers expect of black and white children? And that varies too. And these are the kind of influences, these sort of proximal observational influences, that I don't think we can get or account for in models with sort of demographic indicators of experience. Now, if you think about the developing child at age 5 in kindergarten when we have no effects, probably they don't understand much about teacher expectancies at this point, just cognitively. And probably they haven't internalized these kind of stereotypes that exist in our culture, stereotypes that are derived in a history of slavery, segregation, and blocked opportunities in school. But at some point along the way, age 7, age 8, I mean, I can explain why I think that's sort of an interesting age. There's a 5 to 7 cognitive shift. I think children start to get it. Now, could it be that over the first 4 or 5 years of school that children start to get it and therefore disengage? Okay. There's a developmentalist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner who said if you want to try to understand a phenomenon, you should try to change it. And I think that's right. And I've just finished reading Richard Rothstein's book on the achievement gap, which I bet many of you have read. It's really an excellent review. And, you know, he has taken a guess at what might we do to change the achievement gap. And he's got this three-pronged approach, social and economic policies like earned income tax credits and school improvement like better facilities, raising teacher salaries, and so on, and expanding the definition of school to include early childhood, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. And I think that's right. It would be really hard to argue with that three-pronged approach, but given the current political climate, I think, and our limited resources, I think our best bet would be to put resources into programs that direct children, that affect children directly. So programs that target children's achievement, their mental health, their physical health, and so on. So what do I think is likely to work? Well, I'm going to begin with what my implicit, usually theories of change are implicit, so I've started to think about, examine what my implicit theory would be. Well, first of all, because the gap is there by age 3, I think we have to start early, which is why I'm excited that we're talking about early childhood education tonight. So many of the discussions in this school focus on K through 12. And the second aspect of my theory of change really is that I think it's most likely that the gap is a product of black children's disengagement from schools. So clearly we need to come up with interventions that will keep children engaged. And in fact, early childhood education should help with this, because one of the best ways to ensure success in school is by making sure the kids have a good, first experience. If you start kindergarten and you don't know your letters and you don't know your numbers and there are other children in the class and they do, that is going to be discouraging, even to a 5-year-old. So, in terms of interventions, I think child care, center-based child care makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, currently the way child care is distributed in this country is that families with fewer economic resources are more likely to be in poorer quality programs. And that is not surprising. In the United States, in general, early childhood education is mediocre at best, and I can tell you if you want during the discussion the evidence for that, because there's a trade-off between affordability and quality that's guaranteed by our lack of government participation, and that really separates us from most of the Western industrial societies on the planet. So an easy policy recommendation to make is to increase enrollment of black children in high-quality early childhood education programs. And I'm not talking about Head Start, because actually most Head Start programs aren't of very high quality. And I think there's reasonable data upon which to make that recommendation. I mean, Steve Barnett, who's an economist, has written extensively about the cost-benefit ratio of early childhood education programs. And again, I can talk more about that. I can also talk about my own work, which shows that even when you're talking about mediocre child care, children from families with fewer economic resources profit more from quality child care at the poverty level than middle-class children do. So you can almost, not completely, but even in my data set, you can almost eliminate the gap between poor and middle-class children by enrolling them in high-quality child care, which sometimes just happens accidentally. The second component that I think is important and that would be a part of an intervention that I would design has to do with relationship building between teachers and children. I think there are a lot of ways that we could study this, but basically by encouraging teachers to engage in relationship building, I think we would run a good chance of preventing the kind of disengagement that I'm worried about happens. So, for example, during the early childhood years, you could do a practice called looping, where you have teachers stay with children for several years, and what that does is it it increases teachers' investment in the children. I can also imagine doing teacher relationship intervention studies, and this is something I've talked about with Rick Weisbord and Bob Spellman, who work in our risk and prevention program here. I think mentoring programs might be very important as well. Just things that give black children and poor children some knowledge that they can do it. I mean, that's basically what I'm talking about, and that people are invested in them. And I don't mean to downplay other programs that I know would be, or other interventions that I know would be important, things like parent involvement or other learning supports like after-school summer camp. Actually, one of the things Rothstein talks about is the importance of activities like athletics, dance, and drama, and so on, which build self-confidence in children, and I think that's right. And there is some data that one could bring to bear on that, full-service schools that focus on health care and so on. So going forward as social scientists, that's what I think we need to do, are some of these very large-scale intervention studies, and they would have to be large-scale because children are nested within classrooms that are nested within schools. And so I hope we can, during the next phase of research, do some of these experiments to try to figure out if we can eliminate this gap. That's probably a good place to stop. Okay.
I wanted to just highlight we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I wanted to highlight, though, the fact that Roland can explain the gap as of kindergarten by the family background factors. Remember, there are gaps in those family background factors, and a number of those gaps are in parenting practices as of kindergarten and the preschool years. So we start thinking about giving kids experiences, preschool and early school year, that are academically rich. My inclination is to keep in mind we're talking about both experiences at home and in extra preschool programs with a mind to the kinds of developmental processes that all three speakers paid some attention to. But the microphone is open now for comments, questions. You can go to the mic. Lady. Okay. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if any of the studies that, I'm not familiar with this literature, but I'm wondering if any of the studies control for family wealth. Those data are hard to get, but I do know that there are racial differences at the same income level in terms of wealth or net worth, and that could be significant if you have white and black families at comparable income levels, but the white families have more net worth. They can provide more resources in the home that helps to educate their children.
Right, absolutely. So you can't do it with these data because you only have a cross-section of income at a particular time, but you can use it, you can do the panel study of income dynamics as a child developmental supplement that you can hook into the regular data. And it's one of the only data sets I know of where you can find they have a wealth supplement, so stock options, all the things that might be correlated with wealth. And the analysis I remember from those data are that it does reduce the gap over and beyond just controlling for temporary income in a cross section, but it doesn't fully eliminate the gap in the test scores they have in the PSID. Again, those are for older kids too.
I think one other comment on that. There's also research that shows it matters if you have sustained low income versus low income in a year. It really does make a difference whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 2 years.
I just wanted to ask you, Kathleen McCartney, the family, the parent, particularly the parent, minority parent, black parent, there is the assumption that the parent, when the child goes to school, particularly the parent who can't cope, who can't do maths, who can't read, will necessarily be in favor of the child's learning. To what extent can actually concurrently improving the reading skills, the kind of critical knowledge of the parent, actually of the poor parent, make her able to support the child? I have children and I come from third world and English is my second language. But actually the assumption that the family, that the parents will support the child, middle class parents are able to support the child because they can recognize that the child won't go away if the child is getting. I was wondering, in context of family, black family, the importance of actually teaching the parents themselves to achieve as a child achieves, of improving the kind of the cultural pedagogy of the child, of bringing the parent into the educational system, because it's alien.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think my reading of there have been numerous intervention studies, not just with black families, but in general with families from, with fewer economic resources, from low SES families. And these intervention studies that have tried to influence parenting, my reading of them as a whole is that it's pretty hard to do. I think it's hard to do. So that's why I said if I were making a bet in terms of where to invest intervention dollars, I would do it through the schools, and I would do it through programs that directly influence children. But I take your point about the importance of parent involvement, and I take your point about how difficult it is for children to succeed in school when there aren't the necessary learning supports at home. I want to tell you about one Head Start study that was done at University of North Carolina by Donna Bryant. Now, children in Head Start, there's a huge restriction of range with respect to the family's SES. But even there, they found that the children who were more likely to profit from Head Start were those from families with more economic resources. And so they speculate that even within this poor sample, when there are more learning supports at home, the children are able to take advantage of the curriculum experience through Head Start. And I think that's probably right.
With regard to the parenting piece, though, and our ability to affect parenting, I agree with you. I've seen some evidence that it's really hard to change parenting through the parenting programs. At the same time, the early childhood programs that have shown the really lasting effects through teen years and even into early adulthoods have been the ones that were more thoroughly ecological in nature, so that they worked with the kid and the family. And it appears, my guess is they really were having some effect on home life and home intellectual climate that helped to sustain the gains that came from the early childhood programs. So the evidence is mixed. I think in the room we probably have some differences of opinion about the degree to which we really want to still keep working at that parent piece, even though we haven't shown we can do a lot with it so far. But your point's well taken. We don't have the evidence. Right. Couldn't convince a skeptic based on the evidence that working on the parenting piece is the place to go right now, although I have a strong interest in doing that.
I mean, are you really hopeful that our government will actually do something for 3-year-old children? I mean, how many years have you been talking about, the government really getting involved and having good programs, and it's never happened? I mean, do you actually see it happening now?
Well, the Early Education for All bill passed last year in Massachusetts, and I think there are many communities that are going to at least have preschool beginning at age 4. But I think what we need to do is really have some successful demonstration projects, some successful intervention results, so that policymakers will want to make those kinds of investments.
It's just that you hear about the cuts, you get so discouraged.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to argue about the discouraging political climate right now for poor children. I agree with you.
I think the encouraging news is that most of the action is going to be at the state level, actually. I mean, states are really the sort of key initiative takers. If you look over the past 15 years, there are some states, like North Carolina, that have made huge gains in achievement over time. North Carolina in 1990 was ranked about 37th among states. And the last test, they were like 12th. And you can look in North Carolina and show that combination of government leadership, good use of research, and an early childhood program, Head Start program, or not Head Start, Smart Start, that they tried to address the whole sort of from birth on up. Now, some of those have sort of varying kinds of evaluations, but all I know is that there are a few states that have made dramatic gains for their students over the last 15 years. And we're going to know even more about how to do it more efficiently in the next 15 years. But it is, I don't expect, in many ways, I won't say I've given up on the federal government, but I don't see the federal government as the decisive player in this anymore. It really is state by state matter, and I think even as important a local matter. Money may be key at the federal level, but and you may have to have some of that, but it really is the way in which states spend the money and the way in which the local governments are able to successfully implement stuff that I think is going to be key.
I think my short answer is no. I think that until we declare the achievement gap a national emergency, which I think it is, until we get very disturbed by the fact that people are coming in relatively similar and losing 3 months of ground over the first 2 years of school, until we decide that we can't sleep with that result. I just have no hope. I think the idea that we're farming out PhDs being farmed out to other countries is going down is not going to be enough to generate demand to close the achievement gap. So I'm sorry, there's no hope. I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your work. I'm sorry I was a little bit late, but I wondered if the language that you've been using is black families and black children. I just wondered, was that qualified earlier to specify in terms of, in other words, do your findings include black children who come from so-called middle-class families or families in which the parents are educated? Are you finding that they also reflect this lower achievement?
Yes. At least in the data that I was showing, this was all accounting for, this was looking at black families along the income spectrum.
Oh, okay, thanks. And I just wondered, the lady had mentioned that one of the proposals was going to be relationship building. And I just wonder if you've seen much happen with that. I can just remember from my own experience in my grammar school, there's actually a teacher who was very close to us in the 3rd grade who requested to have us in the 4th grade. And you could really see the effects of that type of bond and that type of an investment.
Yeah, I don't think it is really, but I think for some people it's looking like it's a new frontier. And so people are talking about it, but I don't know of any really good intervention studies yet.
Can I just mention, you said, for one, the Achievement Gap Initiative generally is not only about black-white. It's about racial and ethnic and social class patterns. Let me also point out, though, that in a number of data series, it's the highest income, the highest education groups where the gaps are largest. Okay, if you take blacks versus whites, for example, with advanced degrees, you'll find some pretty big achievement gaps among their children. You'll find that blacks, in the early childhood longitudinal survey that Roland was analyzing, black mothers who report that they have college degrees self-report the same number of books in the home as white mothers who say they have high school degrees or less. Okay, and there are just differences in parenting. We're socialized by our parents to know how to parent, and we can tell deep historical stories to explain to ourselves why parenting practices are different. So we've got to work on a number of different fronts, and parenting is a piece of it. And this is not just a socioeconomic pattern. There are big racial differences even after you adjust for what we would think of as our usual social economic measures. And they are in some of the domains that Roland talked about, those other things he's able to measure with regard to parenting practices on the much more specific level.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, before we leave parenting practices as like the black box culprit, I don't think we've done an adequate job tonight of unpacking what we mean by that and saying, I think if people leave with a quick notion that certain people parent differently and certain people parent wrong without an really nuanced analysis of what we mean by parenting practice, I think that would be very dangerous. So
you're falling into that liberal hole we talked about.
Okay. Touche, but still.
First, I wanted to say thank you for putting this series together. It's just been a tremendous learning experience over the last 3 sessions. And I wondered if you'd be willing to say a word about where the Achievement Gap Initiative is headed, what you want to do over the next year or more with forward. I'm particularly struck by the fact that most of these wonderful contributors have begun their remarks by saying, I'm an anthropologist, and here's what I see, and I'm an economist, and here's what I see. And I'm imagining that you have among your many challenges, interdisciplinary challenge to bring all this together and really wrap it. But I just would welcome knowing where you're headed.
Where we ultimately head depends upon the degrees of involvement that we can sustain among the faculty who are engaged with us. But the aspiration, the dream of this is for the group here to be one node on a national network of people who are working on similar issues, and for us to connect our research to the ground so that we're trying to figure out what are the most important things to know that can be of assistance to policymakers and practitioners and parents and teachers. And so we're having some meetings. We're in the process of putting together some meetings for late June where it's likely that we will have some practitioners there where we're engaging researchers and practitioners trying to identify the most important things that are worthy to be known and try to figure out how we can operate over time interactively. I mean, researchers, we do a lot of hypothesis testing, and we work with big data sets. We don't talk very much about design and implementation, and what people would talk about is formative evaluation, which is kind of like management consulting. You're trying to figure out how things are working as they're working to give feedback and have some exchange. So we want to continue to do the kinds of theory and big data set analyses that we're used to doing and the kind of ethnographic work that Micah and others do. But we want more and more to do that interactively with people who are actually doing it on the ground so that it's not waiting until we're finished cooking our little meal to serve it up. We want to learn much more interactively over time with this, and whether we can pull that off is an open question at that point, but that's the way that I've been thinking about it. Anybody else who's part of the initiative who's in the room that wants to comment on that is welcome to, because we're setting this direction collaboratively.
Thanks. Thanks to everybody tonight and all of you who have presented before in this series. I've been to all three, and I'm thinking of I think it was Young, Gifted, and Black. I think it was 2003. Teresa Perry, Claude Steele, and someone else I can't remember. Who was it? Hilliard, right. And actually, that's the person I wanted to reference. Okay, so I'm thinking if focusing on the achievement gap as such is actually, I guess you could say, worth it, or what is left out by looking at it in terms of a gap between black and white students. Are we convinced necessarily that achieving either on standardized tests, which are problematic in a number of ways, or achieving in school is necessarily learning? And do we want to shrink a gap, or do we want to make sure that black kids are learning, for example, if you want to pick a specific ethnic group? So just as a way of trying to conceive of how structuring the problem and looking at it in certain ways will affect the outcome of the research.
I just want to, you were here Monday. I don't know, you probably don't remember the first slide I put on the screen. Monday I started. The achievement, the wage effects. Right? I mean, I was never that interested in test scores before. You know, I was looking at wage equations, trying to figure out how we could deal with employment problems and income levels. And I took the Armed Forces Qualifications test scores that's in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and by just putting that in the equation, the coefficient on black was cut more than in half. So anything that can knock out more than half the black-white hourly earnings gap gets my attention. Okay? And that's why I got interested in test scores as measures of achievement. And as for a nation, there will be no racial majority group in the United States by mid-century. Okay, if we get to mid-century and the achievement gap is as big as it is and the opportunity gaps appear to be what they are, and we've got that much disparity and whites are a minority, we're going to have some really strange politics. Okay, you can go to places like Malaysia where Chinese are a minority, but they dominate in the economy. All kinds of things outside the boundaries of what we usually think of as the rules for how we do things can start operating. And so I would argue it's not just about social class. It's really about kids from all kinds of different backgrounds feeling that they got a shot at succeeding, and where race not being a strong predictor of access to opportunity or achievement levels or income levels or any of those other things. So we could debate this. We stay here another hour and talk about these issues. But in my view, we got to get the racial differences much smaller than they are now in order to manage the racial tensions later on when we get a racial common mix where whites are not going to be able to dominate as easily in a world where the majority may feel that whites are just a little bit too influential. And you start getting just a lot of really strange politics. And we got a couple generations to work on this to get it right in the meantime. Although none of us are going to argue we know yet about how to get it right. And we need to have a lot more exchanges like this so we can all learn from each other and figure out maybe we do need to change our conception of the problem. But this is where we are. I don't know if any of you want to.
I think that's exactly right. That once you control, so if you don't look at test scores and you just look at education and not controlling for quality of education and things like that, the black-white race, the racial gaps in income look like blacks are down by a third. But once you actually put in test scores, it really does matter. So I'm not a big fan of test scores in and of themselves at all as well, but they're correlated with wages, as Ron said, and even perhaps more importantly with life expectancy and other health outcomes. So I think
if we can get a better measure, we can use them.
Well, no, but then does that influence the goal of the initiative? Should it be the wage earning initiative, instead of the achievement gap initiative? Like, what's the actual goal? Are we trying to shrink the gap to make?
I want my kids to know to be able to answer the kinds of questions the standardized tests measure. And if they, I said, I would like the 3 children who live in my household to be able to answer those questions. Because they're questions that, in order to be a citizen in this country, to understand what's going on in the news, to be able to function on a jury effectively, to feel like you're not left out of the conversation, you need to know that. Now, maybe there's some stuff you need to know that's also not on those tests. And it is a serious problem that instruction is sometimes distorted so much by the existence of the tests that teachers don't cover a bunch of other things that I'd also want my kid to know. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, I want to try to strike the right balance. And I'm not sure any of us knows what the right balance is right now. But rather than fight the test, I just want to prepare my kid to pass it. Okay, I don't want to pay too big a price for that, but that's basically what I want to do.
There's a second objective there, which is that, I mean, most of the social cost we pay in adulthood, and increasingly it's being linked to health cost, arise from kids we don't school well, basically. So there's a tremendous downstream cost which is generated by our lack of success in this. And if you look at the early childhood programs that have had long-term outcomes, you can show that the rate of return on investments can be greater than private sector rates of return based on starting some of these programs. I think there's some flaws in that, and the efficiency goes down, but it's beginning to seem like it's not something to do because we need to be equitable. It's something we need to do just for the sake of economic efficiency. And I think the other thing that is sort of always interesting to me, if we go back, the 1950s and look and say, how are we going to keep our economy going in the next 30 years, I doubt if anybody would have said, well, we need to put women to work. That's been absolutely key to, our economic growth and development over that time period, to the point where now, more women in medical schools. I mean, the fact that we had a labor force which was willing and partly willing and well qualified to come in, we can't do with a poor labor force. I mean, you can't run an economy like we're trying to do. And the labor force is increasingly coming from groups that have score gaps. And I think we can depend less on foreign talent, and I still think that's important. And so, I don't know, there can be a number of things coming together. One is simply economic efficiency would dictate some of this stuff. And there was one calculation done that showed, tried to project out if we implemented certain early childhood programs, that about the savings out 30 or 40 years would solve about a third of the Social Security gap. Although one of the interesting things I think about the current Social Security debate, it's the first time I've seen anybody try to make Americans think 30 years in advance. And, not having a huge amount of success with that, But if that goes through, we can start thinking 30 years in advance about some other pretty important topics as well, which is the real rationale for why you should invest now in some of these programs. They're not going to have payoffs for 30 or 40 years, but it could be that the payoffs they have may be as certain as the stock market payoffs of private accounts.
Last question.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Dr. Fryer, I wanted to ask you, as a Latina educator, and have you done any studies around what the effect of language and also the effect of the expectation that the educational environment places on students of color?
So in terms of language, I'm a person that essentially binds myself to the data. So the ECLS is one of the most comprehensive data sets we have, and the only thing we have in there about language is whether or not you speak English at home, for example. We really have no continuous measure of one's fluency in a particular language. But I think that's as time goes by, data sets will get more and more sophisticated, and we'll get better and better measures of fluency. And I would love to actually see at least correlate that with outcomes. I think that'd be absolutely terrific. As I said, I think that a lot of the Hispanic results of them actually catching up over the first 2 years of school could be attributed to language. But just looking at whether or not they speak English in the home or not is not fine enough in some sense to actually get at the nuances that you'd want to do. In terms of expectations, I think that's a terrific question. I mean, I know Ron has done some work on this, and a lot of others as well. And I have one interesting piece of evidence, but nothing that I'm willing to hang my hat on, which is if you ask the teachers or even ask parents, one of the things that I didn't, this is a footnote, one of the things that I didn't emphasize in these slides, and one of the things that comes across in the third grade paper that we wrote, the extension of this, the first 2 years, it's the first 4 years of school, is that girls are actually losing ground in math at a faster rate than blacks are losing ground relative to whites. Right? And you might think that expectations have a lot to do with that as well. And what we see in that data is that if you ask the parents, in third grade, they actually asked the parents, how good do you think your daughter, your son is in mathematics and in reading? And what you saw was the correlation between how good the parents did, forget school expectations, how good the parents thought the kids were and their actual test scores. The correlations were less for blacks and for women than it was for white males. But beyond that, I just don't have any slick way of thinking about how expectations influence test scores other than just correlating things that you might think would be associated with certain expectations with test scores.
Yeah, I should mention, I know at least one colleague, and I think maybe I've heard another talk about this. When students are not completely fluent in English, teachers have a very difficult time making a judgment about how much the student understands. They talk about gifted and talented, identifying gifted and talented kids, and so on. They're just much less accurate in calibrating where the student is if there's a language issue. And I'm not sure that's a critique of the teacher so much. It's just a report on part of the challenges and maybe part of the supplemental support. So we need more bilingual teachers in schools to help out for this kind of thing.
But I think in general, this is a general statement about a lot of the things that have been said tonight, which are interesting avenues and perhaps promising avenues to actually close the achievement gap. But I think in general, my opinion is we just need more facts. We need to understand the impact of language fluency on test scores. We need to understand whether or not developmental programs or relationship building between teachers and students can help close the achievement gap or in certain interventions. But until we get the facts, until we actually have the data to really test these things, it's going to be difficult to convince the government or anybody else that we have the smoking gun until we actually have the facts to back up the theories that we're telling you tonight.
And we can start developing the facts in a way that's interactive with practice rather than only asking people to wait till we have the facts before they try to do anything.
I'm waiting on the facts.
Yeah. All right, well, you'll still hear wait on the facts, and I'll play the interface, and some other folks can do some other pieces of it.
That's why we have
But I think with that, we need to wrap up the evening. We're over time, and thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who have come for all three sessions.